What's up everyone, Ben here, and today we are going to be breaking down IFBB pro bodybuilder Iain Valliere's chest day. I believe this is a recent workout that he did with his coach in the Olympia prep series, which is the Olympias, I think, within 2 weeks now, 1 or 2 weeks, something like that. So he's sort of at the tail end of his prep. Let's dive right in, take a look at all the exercises he's got going, and I will add some tips, tricks, and adjustments that you can make maybe to make this a little bit more individual to you. All right, so first exercise here is a high to low cable fly. Now, the high to low cable fly I love for training lower portions of the chest, right? So from the perspective of training the chest and really any other tissue, we really just want to think about this idea of following the fibers, right? So a high to low motion will stretch in line a little bit more with those lower or costal pec fibers, the ones that run more low to high. And as you contract, as you squeeze, and as you can see as Iain does, he kind of brings his hands in closer together, sort of down aimed at the lower end of the sternum, which is where those fibers, or a majority of them, tend to move toward in terms of a direction. Now, the only kind of adjustment that I would make to this specific movement is bench. So a lot of times with these fly type motions, even though you may end up in a situation where you do have a good amount of tension through that costal pec, no doubt, you will end up at some point in terms of just from the perspective of load, getting pulled to a little bit more of an unstable position that you would like to. So whenever we're thinking about how can we set up exercises in the most efficient manner, from a hypertrophy perspective at least, we want to make sure that when we are trying to create force against something, we have an equal and opposite force to, or close to opposite force to utilize to sort of resist against that force. So this is why this second option here is a fantastic option, which is the hammer strength chest press, which, as you can see, has a bench. And people don't think that's necessarily something to ever really notice in the first place. It's like, yeah, duh, that's part of the machine. But asking yourself why it's a part of the machine in the first place, I think, is useful when you start to look across other exercises to apply similar principles. So there's really no reason not to have a bench in an exercise like the costal pec fly, that lower pec fly, to have that equal and opposite force that can kind of push us forward against that load, or rather something that we can push back into. That's another way of thinking about it, much like this chest press variant. So just one comment on this particular machine. A lot of people report when using these kinds of converging machines not feeling too much comfort through shoulder or through elbow. So what I would highly recommend in terms of finding your optimal grip width, you can see Ian's pretty wide because he's a really, really wide dude, is basically just as a test, reach your hands forward and just pull them back to a position you think would be most comfortable. And wherever you pull back to a little bit tighter to your body, or just basically wherever your arm can move as far back in space as possible, you'll notice you'll run into a little bit of a stop if you bring your arm too high, and if you shove your arm too close, you'll also run into a stop. Somewhere in the middle, you'll have the most amount of backward motion or extension of the arm, the shoulder specifically. And that's kind of the position where you want your hand to end up. So a lot of these machines don't fit people's, we'll say, range of joint mobility, their structure particularly well. So a great way to try to sort of assess whether or not the specific machine is built well for you is, can you get into that comfortable position on your own without grabbing the handles at all? And then just see if you can kind of grab the handles on top of that. A really important point to note here is that with any sort of converging machine, i.e. a machine that goes from wider to more narrow, from wider than shoulder width to more narrow than shoulder width, you're going to end up with a situation where that last portion of the rep, that last couple inches where you could lock out, is going to be really, really freaking hard on, again, most of these plate-loaded machines, because most of them tend to get heavier toward the top of the range. But with a machine like this, which I don't know specifically how it's built, it's highly likely that it's built with a resistance profile, i.e. how heavy the machine acts on you when you press, that is a little bit more favorable toward the mechanics of the pec. So you get really, really weak, for those of you who don't know, in the short position when you're squeezing your pec fully, and you're much stronger in that more lengthened position. So you're pretty much always going to be stronger here in that bottom end of the range, even though, mechanically the weight is acting on you a little bit more here, especially in a free weight press. As you start to lock your elbow, even though that distance to your shoulder and your elbow is shortening, it's still usually disproportionately hard for people, which is often why you don't see people fully locking.
converging press because it's not like a straight angular pattern. It's more of a rounded pattern, but it's nice. I would maybe like it to converge or like come out a little farther. Feels like it comes in a little tight. I'd like to get a little more extension, but.
So something you'll notice a lot of the bigger guys doing is staying with those more pronated positions, right? So if my hand is, or if my shoulder is here and I twist my hand as far that way as I can, you can see that I kind of move past where the handle would be. But just for all intents and purposes, you're pretty close to a fully pronated position, i.e. that palm turning that same way that I'm demonstrating. And the bigger guys will tend to need to naturally be wider because their physical structure is wider than most people. But something that's really important to note is that many of you are not going to be this wide. Now, there may be some of you who are pros or bigger dudes watching this, and so that's helpful in terms of just understanding that everything is individual to you, right? So the wider you are, the wider you're probably going to grip things. But a majority of you will not be that wide. If you were, then you'd all be competing at the Olympia in a couple weeks. The other thing that I'll note here too is this kind of a chest press has two options for grip, right? So one that you see Iain actually gripping himself, this wider one, and then one you see the neutral grip, which in terms of if your arms were here would pretty much be a supinated or palm up to the ceiling in this case grip, right? That forearm rotation is kind of what we're talking about. A lot of you are going to be in a really good situation if you do end up grabbing that neutral handle, if it's not too wide. So for the majority of people, I actually would recommend the neutral handle if your goal is to train pecs, nonetheless. And just for reference, in case I didn't mention it, I'm not sure, the last two presses are fairly similar in terms of the muscular recruitment. Lower and middle pec is going to be the sort of the name of the game, although because they are pressing based motions and because the pecs do wrap around the rib cage in that sort of all of them in the same sort of a way, with any sort of press or more lengthened pec exercise, you're going to get a good amount of stimulus in all three divisions, right? The upper, the middle, and the lower. All right, so here's where I kind of start to run into a little bit of disagreement around some of the things that I see a lot of pros doing, which is a lot of not only similar type motions, just sort of repeated through the same, workout, but also just similar constraints, right? So started with a fly, then went to a wider press, then went to another sort of wider but more narrow press, and then now an even wider fly. Like I said, I don't necessarily think that these are bad movements per se, but in place of a fly, I would have probably liked to have seen something that's a little bit more low to high, and maybe he'll do something like that after. But from the perspective of flies and training pecs, I'm not a huge fan of them just because the stretch component of the movement is a little bit diminished, specifically because, again, like I mentioned, those pecs stretch tighter to the rib cage. They don't stretch with the arms way out here. Of course, they will stretch to some degree, but in terms of the leverage that they have, the leverage will be significantly diminished the more that you move your arm up and out into this sort of externally rotated position, right? My hand going behind my body in this case. And they'll tend to gain leverage, i.e. they'll be in a better position to produce force if your arm is a little bit tighter to your body, which for Iain, again, will still be wider. But in terms of just the whole pec fly thing, I think most pec flies can just kind of go out the door at this point in place of pressing and, cable variants that will stretch the pecs and give them better leverage overall.
2, 3, 4. Fourth exercise, we just did a pec deck there. Seat real low, really focusing on that inner upper chest. And then just have me do like a isometric contraction at the end.
So something to note when pros kind of talk about what their intent is, the intent may be correct from the standpoint of they're actually able to squeeze the middle upper chest. But from the perspective of load and loading direction, like I mentioned, if you wanted to load more of the upper portions of the pec, you would want to load that you're sort of pushing up as opposed to pushing down. All right, sort of we started at the beginning of this video mentioning just follow the fiber direction. So this is what Iain's demonstrating now is a little bit more in line with what I was sort of envisioning. But again, I would still probably put those cables and those levers that he's actually pulling from now a little bit lower so that he could press, like I said, not only tighter to his ribs, and he wouldn't have as long of a lever to sort of manage in that position, but he could also, again, stay tighter to his ribs and also come a little bit low to high as opposed to just this more wide position to wide position. See, when you're this big, you can just have boys change the weight and give you the handles.
Yeah, very good.
All right, so something I want to comment on specific to this end range position. A lot of you might notice, and you look kind of, look at the cable direction, look at his hand, look at his arms, look at his biceps in this spot. If anyone were to sort of freeze frame this exercise, yeah, it's like, okay, we got a good amount of stretch on the pecs, no doubt, to some degree, just based on position. But we also have a good amount of loading just through elbow flexors, i.e. the muscles that bend the elbow and allow the elbow to move straight when there's a load pulling it straight. So there's a lot of load on biceps, which is, again, is sort of another reason why I don't tend to love pec flies as a chest exercise. Is a lot of times we end up in this position where using a straight arm is uncomfortable because we are more limited in range and just structural constraints when we're moving our arms back. So we kind of have to bend our elbows, but then we bend our elbows and now there's a lot of stress on the elbow flexors, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just like probably pick a different exercise to do that. And then 3, because there's a lot of stress on elbow flexors, now there's a lot more force going through the sort of front of the shoulder, and now we have to create more co-contraction in this position that's not inherently very particularly stable from a muscular perspective. So again, a host of reasons to kind of, I don't want to sort of demonize any exercise, but it's more like not necessarily that I would never have anyone do this ever, more so that I think that although there may be a time and place in a particular context for a vast majority of people, if you're looking to train your pecs, just press tight to the ribs. If you want to train more of that short position, use cables.
Yes. If you want to touch the little fingers, come on. Nice. Come on. Good.
So again, like I mentioned earlier, I'm not a huge fan of this sort of redundancy style of training. Seems like everything is basically the same movement, just over and over and over again. And so again, I'm well aware that this is sort of the pro bodybuilder style. It's more of a bro split approach. But I do think that a majority of people, because they're not using a bro split, will need to just do more total exercises for different groups in the same day. So I don't necessarily think this is something that's relevant to most people. But it is obviously something that a lot of pros have done. Newsflash, a lot of the stuff that pros tend to do, and this is not every pro, not all the time, of course, often don't work out too well for the lay person. All right, so moving on to triceps to cap off this push day. Rope pushdowns, I'm not a huge fan of the rope. I think the longer the rope, the better. But in terms of the sort of physics-based perspective on like what the rope does, makes it, number one, disproportionately difficult toward the bottom end of the range, where you're weaker mechanically. So the triceps, as you straighten the elbow, actually get a good deal weaker, just in terms of the output that they can produce. And so if the rope makes the bottom a little bit harder, what tends to happen is toward the bottom, you start to see sort of cheating with the shoulder, which, as you can see, if you look at Ian's shoulder here, tends to want to roll forward and move forward, even though he's really, really good at, maintaining control of his body. Even for someone like him, if you create a constraint where he sort of has to move forward, if he's aiming in that direction, it's going to happen regardless. So regardless of how much you sort of mentally tell yourself, hey, keep the shoulders back, keep the shoulders back, if you are unable to produce that force with the triceps because you're really strong at the top and then really weak at the bottom, you're going to get some degree of help from other tissues, the shoulders in this case, things that will pull the shoulders forward. The other thing that I would say is, in the specific instance of the rope versus other cable variants, I much prefer other cable variants that load the elbow one arm at a time. So you could be grabbing 2 individual cables or just a single cable at one time. And that would really, really make sense from an elbow health perspective, because the elbow only hinges in one direction, regardless of where you rotate your shoulder, up here, down here. The elbow only bends in one direction because it is a hinge. And so we want to load it in one direction. We don't want to really put ourselves in a position where we're not loading the elbow in the plane of motion it's supposed to be loaded, which, for those of you who don't know, is kind of this like side bendy direction. The rope is a huge step up from any sort of straight bar or V-bar variant pushdown for a number of reasons, mostly just because you can move the handles. But again, I just think it makes much more sense to choose an implement that you can load out to in, so that all the focus is on the elbow and we don't really have too much load on the shoulders. And so that we also don't really have to compensate in that bottom end of the range with other tissues that are not the triceps. All right, so I'm sure many of you have seen and potentially used this machine. I think this is actually a really solid option if you're able to appropriately stabilize yourself. And as you can see, Ian is doing it single arm, which is a fantastic adjustment to make, especially if you're a bigger dude. Most people are not really going to be able to squeeze in here and have their elbows move in that same plane of motion. Even if you put your arms in here naturally, they're going to kind of want to come out a little bit out of line with the machine, which again, as I mentioned earlier, we don't want to create these rotational forces on the elbow that would otherwise load them in a way where, you know, we're taxing the structure. And so doing it single arm is a really, really great way to sort of avoid loading the connective tissues, specifically within the elbow, you know, the ligaments, the bones themselves, as opposed to just the muscles and the muscle tendon units. Because like I said, again, want to load elbows in the plane of motion that they're meant to move. Doing it single arm is a great way to do this. And here's a great transition into the next exercise, which is a cable variant. I think most people are probably going to be better off not having to grab something in a fixed handle. So something I like to do a lot with these triceps extensions is actually just grab the ball of the cable that they are on, which, and for most people, can be fine most of the time, but eventually you may get to a point where that's too heavy. You may get too strong in the movement for your hands to support and just hold that ball on the cable. So what you can do instead is you can actually get a cuff or something like that, loop the cuff into the just the regular loop there, the regular carabiner, and then just slip your hand through the cuff and you can have something to push directly down against. If you don't have a cuff, what you can do is you can grab a D handle, one of those handles that sort of slides within the loopy, and you could just move the handle away so that you can stick your hand into the loopy and be able to sort of use it that way. I think this is a great exercise that Iain is doing from the perspective of just the elbow and loading the elbow in the direction of motion it's meant to be loaded in. But from the perspective of the hand, there's going to be a lot of stress on the wrist and the forearm that, you know, maybe that's part of his goal, and I don't know, and so that's a different story. But I'm willing to bet that his goal with this is to train more his triceps than anything else. So like I said, I would recommend a little bit different of an implement. But from a loading direction and a setup standpoint, doing stuff single arm, especially for bigger guys, like I said, is a fantastic way to load the elbows and really any hinge joint, right? So the knee as well. All right, everyone. So that was Iain Valliere's push day, pretty close to this Olympia. I think there are a lot of great takeaways that Iain can provide people from the perspective of just how to control and execute movements across the board. I think Iain does a really, really good job of making sure that his tempo is super controlled. He's not one of those traditional meatheads who just tries to toss everything. He's slow, he's controlled, he's making sure that he doesn't use a lot of momentum-based intent, right, especially on those lowering portions of all those movements. So kudos to him for that. Only adjustments that I would make, again, like I said earlier, for a majority of people is stick to pressing for pecs. Pick movements that are tighter to the ribs, pick movements that go from high to low, pick movements that go sort of in the middle to the middle, pick movements that go from, you know, a little bit lower to a little bit higher to train those upper pecs, right? And just follow the direction of the fibers. And then outside of that, from the perspective of triceps training, you know, Iain picked a few great movements here. Like I said, I would substitute the rope for something else, maybe just like the second cable exercise that he did. Maybe just more volume of that, or a different variant where his shoulder is in a little bit different of a position to train a little bit different a portion of the triceps. And that one arm variant that he did on that machine was, I think, a fantastic choice. And that adjustment that he made was really, really good from the perspective of just doing it single arm. The same applies for a machine preacher curl. So majority of people are not going to be too comfortable squeezing their arms in here and trying to do curls this way. Much better off just sort of turning away from the arm and doing it single arm. Like I said, to just load that single plane of the hinge as the elbow is meant to be loaded. So if you enjoyed this video, please like it, please share it, and I will see you all in the next one.